Your ex-wife just sacrificed herself to a supernatural debt collector, but the locket you stole says you're still the collateral." The silence in the house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of mutual understanding. It was the hollow echo left behind when two lives, tangled for 15 years, are violently pruned apart. Sarah and I had finalized the divorce exactly 30 days ago. The ink was dry, the lawyers had been paid, and the future we'd meticulously planned, the mortgage, the shared retirement dreams, the dog named Winston, was now just a series of asset divisions and shared custody schedules. I'd moved into the guest room, which was technically still my house, but felt aggressively rented. Every surface held a phantom of Sarah. The half-read paperback on the nightstand, the specific way she folded her towels, a neat military precision I could never master, the lingering scent of lavender soap in the bathroom. The real kicker, the absolute anvil around my neck, was Carol, Sarah's mother. Carol lived 3 blocks away, but since the separation, she'd somehow annexed my home as her secondary residence. She claimed it was to help me transition, a transition that mostly involved her rearranging my pantry, according to an obscure organizational system she called Zen Flow, and loudly critiquing my coffee brewing technique. I knew why she was here, really. Carol never trusted me. Not when Sarah and I were dating, not when we bought the house, and certainly not now. She saw me as the clumsy appendage that had temporarily attached itself to her perfect daughter, and now that I was detached, she was hovering, waiting for me to fall apart so she could sweep in and reclaim Sarah's happiness. This particular Tuesday evening, I was attempting to cook something vaguely nutritious, chicken breast, steamed broccoli, when the back door swung open with unnecessary force, admitting a gust of chilly autumn air and Carol herself. She was wearing one of those aggressively bright athletic tracksuits that suggested she had just finished a rigorous Pilates session, followed by a hostile takeover of a small country. "David," she announced, her voice slicing through the simmering sound of the pan. "We need to talk about the utilities bill." I sighed, turning down the heat. "What about it, Carol? I paid it last week." She marched into the kitchen, placing a brightly colored folder on the granite countertop, right next to my cutting board. Her eyes, the same sharp, critical blue as Sarah's, scanned the room. She looked at the single, slightly sad-looking sprig of parsley I was attempting to garnish the bland chicken with. "It's not about payment, David. It's about usage. You're heating this entire wing of the house like a summer resort. And frankly," she leaned in conspiratorially, dropping her voice only slightly, "it's becoming obvious." "Obvious what, Carol?" I asked, deliberately keeping my tone even. I'd learned long ago that escalating arguments with Carol was like throwing gasoline on a damp fire. It just made a lot of smoke and no actual light. "That you're stalling," she hissed. "It's been a month. Sarah is already looking much happier. She's seeing friends. She's not pretending to enjoy watching historical documentaries anymore. You've had ample time to pack the remainder of your things and vacate the premises so that Sarah can feel comfortable bringing her new life into her own home." I felt a familiar, cold pressure build behind my ribs. I had been slow to move out, yes, but the reason was simple. I didn't want to move out. This was my home. And also, I was broke, nursing a wounded ego, and trying desperately to figure out what David did when he wasn't Sarah's husband. I wiped my hands on a dish towel. "Carol, we went over this with the mediator. The house is currently under dispute for division. I am staying here until we settle that. Legally." She scoffed, a tight, dismissive sound. "Legalities. always with the law when you're cornered, aren't you, David? Look around you. You're a ghost here. You're cluttering up the space where my daughter needs to heal. You are impeding the flow of positive energy." She paused, then took a deep, steadying breath, her eyes narrowing with intent. She didn't need to shout. Her quiet certainty was far more terrifying. "I want you out, David, by the end of next week. I don't care where you go or who you call, but you will not be here when Sarah comes home from her trip this weekend. I need this house ready for her emotional reset." This was it. The final ultimatum, delivered not by my ex-wife, but by the high commander of her family. I looked at her, at the smug anticipation lighting up her face, the absolute conviction that she had won this round. She had engineered this divorce, pushed Sarah toward separation, and now she was delivering the coup de grace, eviction from my own life. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not exactly. It was colder, sharper. It was the feeling of hitting rock bottom and realizing you could start climbing, or you could start digging. I realized with sudden, startling clarity that I had spent the last month playing the victim, the sad, discarded husband waiting for permission to leave. But Carol had just given me permission by demanding it. I smiled, a slow, genuine smile that felt alien on my face. It startled Carol enough that she stopped rearranging the spice rack she'd spontaneously started attacking. "That's actually perfect timing, Carol," I said, pushing off the counter. I walked toward the hallway, not toward my sad little guest room, but toward the deep coat closet near the front door. "Perfect timing for what, David? Don't be dramatic. You can't just run off to a hotel." I pulled the closet door open. It was full of winter coats, forgotten holiday decorations, and a dusty old leather satchel that Sarah had insisted we keep because it belonged to her grandfather. I grabbed the satchel, the leather stiff and cool beneath my fingers, and swung it onto my shoulder. I then reached past the coats and pulled down an object wrapped in an old canvas tarp. "You want me out by the end of next week, Carol? Fine. But I want you to understand something very clearly before I go. You see me as the problem, the thing that needs to be purged from this house so Sarah can have her perfect, clean slate." I pulled the tarp off the object, revealing a heavy, dark wooden trunk, bound with thick, tarnished brass straps. Carol took a step back, her jaw slightly slack. She'd never seen this trunk before. It was old, almost antique, and it smelled faintly of cedar and something metallic. "What is that nonsense?" she demanded, trying to regain control. I set the trunk down heavily on the hardwood floor. The impact made the brass buckle rattle. "This," I said, looking her straight in the eye, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "is the reason Sarah married me in the first place. And it's the reason I'm not leaving this house empty-handed. You see, Carol, when Sarah and I got married, we didn't just sign a marriage license. We signed a contract on something much more interesting." I knelt down and placed my hand on the cool, dark wood of the trunk. I didn't look at Carol, whose breathing had become shallow and rapid. I didn't need to. I could feel her shock radiating across the room. "And you, Carol," I continued, slowly beginning to work at the complex, rusted lock, "are about to find out exactly what stalling really looks like." The silence returned, thicker now, saturated with the unspoken history of that trunk. Carol didn't move. She was frozen like a bird caught in the glare of headlights, her tracksuit suddenly looking ridiculous under the harsh kitchen lighting. The rhythmic clicking as I wrestled with the lock was the only sound. "David, stop that immediately," Carol finally managed, her voice stripped of its usual authoritative bark, sounding thin and reedy. "That is family property. It belongs to the estate. You have no right to. to go through whatever junk Sarah's crazy grandfather left behind. Crazy grandfather? I repeated, my fingers finally finding purchase on the stiff mechanism. Sarah told me he was a historian, Carol, a collector of rare things. I gave the lock a final sharp twist. It didn't yield, but the metal groaned in protest. And you're right, it is family property. Our family property. Until the papers are officially filed and distributed. I stood up, dusting off my jeans, allowing the suspense to stretch taut between us. Sarah had always forbidden me from opening this trunk. She'd claimed it contained sensitive family documents related to her mother's side of the family, old wills, property deeds from the 1920s. Sarah had always been fiercely protective of her mother's secrets, which always struck me as odd given Carol's penchant for oversharing. I don't know what you think you're going to find in there, David, but I'm calling Sarah right now. You are causing distress. Carol fumbled for her phone, her usual composure visibly fracturing. Go ahead, I urged her, leaning against the counter, finally feeling the exhaustion of the last month lift, replaced by a strange, almost manic energy. Call her. Tell her I'm finally looking at the foundation of this marriage she was so eager to demolish. Tell her I'm finding out what she was trying to hide from me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, specialized set of lockpicks I'd bought years ago, a silly hobby I'd indulged in when Sarah joked I needed a less conventional way to unlock the shed after losing the key. It had been gathering dust next to my spare house key, and now it felt like the right tool for the job. The antique lock was crude but resilient. I worked carefully, ignoring the frantic tapping sounds Carol was making as she rapidly scrolled through her contacts, only to hesitate before hitting call. She knew Sarah was on vacation, unreachable until Sunday. She was trapped here with me, and whatever I was about to reveal, she'd have to face it alone. Click. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. I didn't open the lid immediately. I let Carol stare at it, let the weight of the unknown press down on her. The brass straps seemed to gleam ominously. This trunk, I began, my voice low, came into Sarah's possession shortly after her father died. She told me it contained her grandmother's jewelry and a few love letters. I placed my hands flat on the lid. But I never believed that, because whenever I asked about it, Sarah would get this look. The same look she gets when she's lying about where she was last Tuesday night. Carol finally dropped her phone onto the counter with a clatter. Her face was ashen. You're being ridiculous. You're projecting your failure onto an old piece of furniture. Maybe, I conceded, pushing the heavy lid up a crack. A puff of ancient, dusty air escaped, smelling overwhelmingly of ozone and dried parchment. I opened the trunk fully. It wasn't full of jewelry. It wasn't full of faded letters. The trunk was lined with dark, almost black velvet. Resting on that velvet were two things. The first was a stack of crisp, bundled banknotes, 10s, 20s, 50s, so tightly packed they looked like they'd been pressed by a hydraulic lift. They weren't current currency. The dates on the bills looked wrong, oddly crisp for their age. The second item, resting on top of the money like a morbid centerpiece, was a heavy, ornate silver locket, the kind you'd see in a Victorian drama. It was tarnished black, but intricate engravings covered its surface. Not floral patterns, but geometric symbols I didn't recognize. I reached for the locket first. As my fingers brushed the cold metal, I felt a distinct, painful, static shock that made my arm jerk back. "What is that?" Carol whispered, inching forward despite herself, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and avarice. "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my tingling fingertips. "But it's not just old money, Carol. Look closer at the bills." I picked up the top bundle. The paper felt different, almost waxy. Beneath the faded ink, I could make out specific dates that corresponded not just to decades, but to historical crises. World War I bonds, Depression-era savings certificates, things that shouldn't exist outside of museum archives. Then I picked up the locket again, ignoring the prickling sensation this time. It was heavy, too heavy for its size. I found the nearly invisible seam and managed to pry it open. Inside, there wasn't a photograph. There was a small, tightly folded piece of paper, perhaps a note, yellowed to the color of old ivory. But as I unfolded it, a thin crystalline powder drifted out from the crease and settled onto the black velvet. It sparkled faintly under the kitchen light. I recognized the symbol drawn crudely on the note immediately. Sarah and I had argued over it once. It was a sigil she'd had tattooed briefly on her wrist 2 years ago, a design she claimed was just spiritual. I'd seen it used in occult textbooks Sarah occasionally borrowed from the university library, a symbol associated with binding and transfer. I stared at the note, my vision tunneling, the sounds of the simmering broccoli and Carol's ragged breathing fading into a dull roar. The note wasn't a threat or a confession of infidelity. It was a receipt, a ledger entry. It was titled in elegant, spidery script, "Transfer of Assets, Subject David Miller," and beneath the title in Sarah's familiar flowing handwriting was a single chilling sentence, "Payment rendered, binding complete, account closed." Before I could even process what binding complete meant or who the second party in this horrific transaction was, the front door of the house slammed open with explosive force, followed by heavy, booted footsteps charging toward the kitchen. Carol screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. I spun around, still clutching the note and the locket, just as a massive shadow fell across the doorway. It wasn't Sarah. It was a man, tall, dressed in dark, expensive tactical gear, and he wasn't carrying a suitcase or a divorce decree. He was carrying a very large, very serious-looking semi-automatic weapon, and his eyes, when they fixed on me in the open trunk, were utterly devoid of humanity. "The exchange is overdue," the man growled, his voice electronically distorted through a mask that covered the lower half of his face. "The contract holder demands immediate repossession." The roar of the intruder's voice shattered the fragile tension, instantly transforming the quiet domestic drama into a life-or-death siege. Carol's shriek died in her throat as she scrambled backward, knocking over a stack of organic cookbooks in her haste to reach the far corner of the pantry. I didn't hesitate. Years of suppressing every instinct honed by my father, a man who believed the only reliable tool was a prepared exit strategy, kicked in. The man, the operator, the repo agent, was advancing, his weapon held steady, trained squarely on my chest. The crystalline powder from the locket seemed to shimmer in the sudden chaos, catching the light. My hand instinctively darted to the trunk, not to close it, but to shield it. The silver locket, still burning cold against my palm, suddenly felt heavy, almost magnetic. "Stay back!" I yelled, my voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline surge trying to liquefy my knees. I knew yelling was useless against a man whose face was covered and whose mission was apparently lethal, but it bought me a precious half-second. I shoved the trunk lid shut with a deafening thud, the sound barely registering over the heavy, measured tread of the operator's approach. He didn't flinch. He wasn't here for negotiation. My eyes darted around the kitchen, my last known safe space. The island counter, the sharp edge of the butcher block, the rapidly cooling chicken breast, useless against military-grade hardware. Then I saw it. Not a weapon, but a distraction. The simmering pot of water on the back burner intended for the broccoli was now boiling over, steam erupting in a frantic white plume. I dropped the locket back into the trunk, slammed the lid down one final time, and then, instead of trying to run past him, I threw myself sideways toward the stove. I grabbed the handle of the heavy, metal-handled pot with my bare hand, the heat searing instantly, and with a grunt of pain I heaved the entire contents, scalding water and bright green broccoli, directly at the advancing man, and the effect was immediate, if temporary. The blast of hot steam momentarily obscured the man's vision, and the hot water splashed harmlessly against his tactical vest, but it broke his line of sight and ruined his concentration. He roared, a sound of surprise and fury, taking a half step back as he instinctively raised an arm to shield his face from the spray. That was my opening. I didn't run for the front door. I bolted for the utility room door, the one Carol had accidentally left ajar when she burst in. It led to the dark, cramped laundry area, and beyond that, the back exit to the yard. "Carol, run!" I shouted over my shoulder, not waiting to see if she was following. As I hit the utility room threshold, the sound of the intruder recovering was terrifyingly fast. Before I could reach the laundry machine, a deafening crack ripped through the air as the first round impacted the drywall right beside my head, showering me with plaster dust. I dove behind the heavy-duty washing machine just as the second shot tore through the thin wooden doorframe. The entire small room vibrated with the force of the impact. From the pantry corner, Carol let out another strangled sound, a pathetic whimper that suggested her Pilates-honed resolve had entirely evaporated. "It's not the house he wants," I shouted, crawling on my belly toward the back door, desperately trying to work the deadbolt. "He wants the trunk, and what Sarah put in it." I finally hit the deadbolt. It clicked loudly, mercifully unlocked. I kicked the back door open just as the operator was forcing his way through the shattered utility room door. He saw my silhouette framed in the pale, late-afternoon sunlight of the yard. He raised the weapon again, but this time he didn't fire immediately. He stopped, perhaps wary of bystanders, or perhaps just enjoying the hunt. I burst out onto the back lawn, the damp grass cold beneath my bare feet. I didn't look back at the house, or at Carol, or at the armed ghost of my marriage. I ran toward the dark line of the woods bordering the property, the only cover available. But as I hit the first line of overgrown azaleas, I glanced back one last time, compelled by the dread of what I'd left behind. The man with the gun was standing precisely where I had been a second before, framed in the doorway. He wasn't pursuing me yet. Instead, he was looking over his shoulder, back toward the kitchen. His posture shifted. He wasn't focused on the weapon anymore. He reached up and, with a practiced motion, unclipped the radio from his tactical vest. He spoke into the radio, his distorted voice cutting clearly across the yard. "Package unsecured. Retrieval asset compromised. Repeat. The bride is still on site. Initiating Phase 2 containment." My blood turned to ice water. The bride. Not me. Not the trunk. Sarah. I froze, staring at the woods, realizing with a gut-wrenching certainty that Sarah hadn't just gone on a trip to reset. She hadn't run away from me. She had been running from this. And the man wasn't here to kill me. He was here because he thought she was still inside, waiting for the exchange. And now he thought I was trying to help her escape. Suddenly, the woods didn't feel like cover. They felt like the staging ground for something much larger. I heard the distant, distinct thump, thump, thump of an engine starting up. Not a car, but something heavier, like an SUV or a tactical vehicle, moving rapidly up the driveway toward the back of the house. I turned to flee deeper into the shadows, but as I took my first step, my foot landed squarely on something soft and metallic, buried just beneath the grass line. I stumbled, crashing down hard, and looked at what I'd tripped over. A length of heavy-duty reinforced cable, already stretched taut between two thick oak trees flanking the edge of the property line. It wasn't just a tripwire. It was an electronic perimeter fence activated only seconds ago, and before I could scramble away, the cable let out a low, humming zap, and the air around my left ankle erupted in a blinding blue arc of electricity. I screamed, not from pain, but from the instantaneous total paralysis that shot up my leg, locking me to the spot, just as the heavy vehicle rounded the corner of the house and its headlights flooded the yard, illuminating me perfectly for the waiting operative. The electrical shock was searing, a violent jolt that seized my entire left side, locking my muscles into rigid, agonizing immobility. The humming of the perimeter cable faded into a high-pitched whine in my ears, but the paralyzing current remained, pinning me to the damp earth. I could feel the residual energy making the hair on my arms stand on end, a living, vibrating cage holding me captive inches from the tree line. The tactical operator, my unexpected eviction notice, moved with the chilling efficiency of a predator scenting cornered prey. He vaulted over the fallen laundry room door frame with unnerving grace, his heavy boots landing softly on the lawn, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He ignored Carol, who was still sobbing hysterically in the pantry doorway, a pathetic, whimpering audience to the main event. He stopped about 6 feet away, the muzzle of his rifle now lowered slightly, but still pointed with absolute authority. He didn't bother with banter. He'd already made his communication. Now it was just retrieval. "You activated the perimeter," the operator stated, his voice modulator giving his words a flat, robotic finality. That suggests complicity in relocation. Unwise. My mouth was dry, tasting of metal and fear. I tried to force words past my throat to explain that I was just the recently divorced husband, the disposable pawn. But the paralysis was too complete. I could only manage a strained, guttural sound. The operator leaned down, scanning my face with clinical detachment. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was assessing the structural integrity of his catch. His gaze flickered past me, focusing intently on the trunk visible through the broken utility room door. "The asset is still inside. Secure the perimeter lock override. Then we extract the primary subject." He paused, his obscured gaze returning to me. "You are secondary contamination. We'll deal with you after we secure the contractor's mistake." Mistake. That's what Sarah was to him, a contractor's error. As the operator straightened up, about to move toward the house, I felt a strange cold sensation radiating from my left leg, the one currently immobilized by the electric current. The tingling wasn't diminishing, it was intensifying, focusing itself around the area where my foot had made contact with the wire. Then I saw it. A thin, almost invisible line of dark liquid was slowly seeping from the earth directly beneath my boot. It wasn't water. It was thick, viscous, and the color of aged motor oil, reflecting the glare of the approaching vehicle's headlights. This wasn't just a perimeter fence. Whatever system Carol and Sarah had hidden, it wasn't merely designed to keep people out. It was designed to interact with the environment. The operator noticed the black seepage, too. His body language shifted instantly from confident authority to acute alarm. He turned his attention away from the house, toward the ground where I was trapped. "Damn it," he muttered, his modulated voice cracking with genuine frustration. He took a quick step back, deliberately avoiding the spreading slick. "Contamination breach. Override the lock now," he barked into his radio, abandoning the idea of retrieving the trunk first. It was the distraction I needed. The electricity coursing through my leg had become unbearable, but the momentary shift in the operator's focus gave my right arm a fraction of free movement, enough to grab the heavy, tarnished silver locket I had dropped moments before, right next to my outstretched right hand. I snatched it up. The metal was no longer just cold. It felt actively hostile, humming with contained energy. As I gripped it, the paralysis in my left leg abruptly vanished, replaced by a violent, wrenching spasm as my muscles fought to regain control. I fell sideways, rolling away from the direct line of fire, the locket clutched tight. The operator spun back toward me, weapon coming up fast. "Drop the artifact." I couldn't run, I couldn't fight. But I had the locket, the focal point of whatever deal Sarah had made. Driven by instinct and knowing I had seconds before he fired, I didn't try to unlock it again. Instead, I hurled it. Not at the man, but back toward the open utility room door, aiming for the dark interior near the open trunk. The locket sailed through the air, a small dark projectile. As it crossed the threshold into the kitchen, the humming intensified, not from the cable, but from the locket itself. The air around the trunk seemed to shimmer, distorting the view of the kitchen beyond. The operator roared in protest and lunged forward, trying to intercept the artifact before it reached its intended destination. But he was too late. The locket struck the pile of banknotes inside the trunk with a soft thwack. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but an implosion of reality. The air in the kitchen seemed to instantly vacuum out, and a violent, concussive wave of pressure, cold, not hot, erupted from the trunk. The sound barrier didn't just break, it seemed to be forcibly rearranged. The operator, halfway across the threshold, was caught in the blast wave. He was thrown backward as if struck by a freight train, his body twisting sickeningly as he slammed into the far wall, his weapon skittering across the tile floor. I scrambled backward on my elbows, shielded partially by the washing machine, choking on the sudden vacuum. I could hear Carol screaming somewhere between the pantry and the far wall, a sound completely drowned out by the deafening, high-pitched feedback sound now emanating from the open trunk. When the wave passed, the silence that fell was absolute. I cautiously pushed myself up, my ears ringing painfully, my body shaking uncontrollably. The kitchen was ruined. The granite countertop was cracked. Steam was rising from the debris, and the utility room door was now just jagged splinters. I forced myself to look toward the trunk. It was still there, scorched, but intact. But the interior was completely different. The money was gone. The velvet lining was vaporized, and where the locket had landed, there was now a small, perfectly smooth, circular depression in the dark wood. And then I looked past the trunk, through the gaping hole where the door used to be, toward the far wall where the heavily armored man had been thrown. He was gone. There was no body, no tactical vest, no weapon, just a clean scorch mark running from the ceiling down to the floor, as if something impossibly dense and violent had simply erased him from existence. And then, from the house next door, the house Sarah had never let me visit, the house belonging to her elusive, secretive Aunt Beatrice, I heard a faint, echoing sound that chilled me to the marrow. the distinct, unmistakable sound of a woman's laughter, delighted and utterly manic. The manic laughter from the adjacent property was the sound of a predator claiming its territory, the final terrifying punctuation mark on Sarah's carefully constructed deception. It solidified the awful truth. This wasn't a divorce gone sour. This was an arcane transaction gone disastrously wrong. I had stumbled into a secret war fought with arcane assets, and I was the collateral damage. My every instinct screamed at me to flee into the woods, to vanish into the anonymity of the suburban wilderness. But the sound of that laughter and the lingering, ozone smell of the vacuum that had swallowed the armed operative rooted me to the spot. I couldn't leave Carol, even if she was the architect of my misery, and I couldn't leave Sarah to whatever Phase 2 entailed. The contract mentioned closing the account, and I suspected that meant I was now the key to the entire operation. I stumbled toward the kitchen, the air still thick and heavy. Carol was still curled by the pantry, hyperventilating, her tracksuit stained with dirt and fear. "Carol, are you hurt?" I managed, kneeling beside her. She didn't answer, just pointed a trembling finger toward the debris where the operator had been standing. Not only was he gone, but his high-tech rifle was also missing, vanished as completely as if it had never existed. "The trunk," Carol finally gasped, her voice raw. "It wasn't supposed to open. Sarah said the seal was unbreakable unless she performed the final rite herself." "The final rite?" I asked, glancing back at the trunk. The raw wood where the locket had struck seemed to pulse faintly under the kitchen light. "The release mechanism," Carol choked out, pushing herself to a shaky sit. "She made a deal, David, years ago. Not with you, with them. To secure the inheritance, the money in that trunk. It wasn't just old currency. It was tied to a binding contract. A trade." "A trade for what?" I demanded, gripping her shoulder. "For marrying me?" Carol met my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely remorseful, utterly terrified of the consequences of her own machinations. "No, worse. She traded her return for your silence. You were the stabilizer, the anchor. The agreement was that if you two divorced, the contract would terminate, releasing the assets and releasing her from her obligation." "Releasing her from what obligation?" The maniacal laughter from next door erupted again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of a heavy, rhythmic knocking against the shared fence line. "The man who was just here? He wasn't retrieving an asset," Carol whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He was the collection agent. He thought Sarah had left you here, waiting for the divorce to be final so he could erase you and complete the transfer of ownership to the primary creditor before Sarah could execute her end of the deal." "And what was Sarah's end?" I pressed, dreading the answer. "To come back with you, David. The contract stipulated she had to return from her trip with you present and compliant. If you were gone or dead, the contract defaulted. The creditor gets everything, and Sarah—" Carol swallowed hard. "Sarah becomes the collateral." I looked at the trunk, then down at my hands. I hadn't simply stumbled into the middle of a divorce settlement. I had interrupted a supernatural foreclosure auction, and by throwing the locket back, I hadn't destroyed the contract. I had activated the final clause. The trunk was the repository of whatever strange power Sarah had bargained for. The locket was the key, and by shattering the initial seal, I hadn't brought Sarah back. I had called her creditors to retrieve her. "Where is she, Carol? Where is Sarah?" "She's not on a trip. She's at Aunt Beatrice's. She was hiding there, waiting for the divorce to clear before she could sever the binding legally. But if that agent, if they think she's trapped here, they'll take the safest thing they can find to force her out. The knocking on the fence intensified, now accompanied by a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated up through the floorboards. "They'll take you, David," Carol concluded weakly. "They think you're the loophole. If they can't get Sarah, they take the anchor." Suddenly, a familiar scent cut through the dust and ozone, lavender and something subtly sweet. The back door, which I had kicked open, swung slowly inward, pushed by a gentle breeze. Framed in the doorway, bathed in the eerie twilight filtering through the yard, stood Sarah. She looked exhausted, beautiful, and utterly terrified. She wasn't wearing the breezy vacation clothes she'd packed. She was dressed in a severe dark suit, looking every bit the professional negotiator. Her eyes, however, were fixed not on me, but on the scorched trunk. "David," she breathed, taking a tentative step inside, her gaze sweeping over the wreckage of the kitchen. "You shouldn't have opened it." "Sarah, what is happening?" I demanded, pushing myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. "Who are those people? What did you sign?" She walked toward me, deliberately stepping around the perimeter wire and ignoring the frantic pleading in Carol's eyes. When she reached me, she placed a hand lightly on my cheek, her touch familiar yet alien, cool against my skin. "It's complicated, David. It was a way out of debt, a way to secure a future that was impossible otherwise. But I couldn't leave you tied to it. That's why I filed for divorce, to sever the anchor before the transfer date." She squeezed my cheek once, a gesture of desperate affection. But I was too late. You opened the trunk before the paperwork was final. You became the collateral. "So what now?" I asked, my voice cracking with defeat. "Do I just wait for the next heavily armed debt collector to arrive and erase me?" Sarah stepped back, her expression hardening into the resolute mask I'd seen so many times when she was facing down a difficult board meeting. She walked toward the trunk, laying her hand gently on the scorched wood. "No," she said, her voice ringing with unexpected strength. She looked toward the fence, where the thrumming was now dangerously close to a palpable vibration. "They want the contract terminated, and they want collateral. We can't give them both." She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, perfectly folded square of parchment, identical in color and texture to the note I had found in the locket. She smoothed it out on the scorched surface of the trunk. "I can nullify the terms regarding the assets, David," she stated, her voice gaining power. "But there's one final transfer that must be made to keep them satisfied. One thing that can complete the transaction without erasing you." She looked back at me, and in her eyes I saw the agonizing finality of her decision. "They need an anchor, David. They always needed an anchor. The agreement was that one of us stays bound to the debt, the one who has the least to lose." She took a deep breath, bracing herself against the impending violence at the fence line. "I'm giving them the collateral they expect, David. I'm binding myself back to the contract, but I'm changing the terms of the collateral." Before I could move, before Carol could even scream another warning, Sarah took the small square of parchment she held, the secondary agreement, and pressed it firmly against her own chest, directly over her heart. The air in the kitchen did not explode this time. Instead, the entire room was instantly enveloped in a suffocating, profound darkness, darker than any night, a darkness that seemed to actively consume light. I couldn't see my hands, couldn't hear Carol, couldn't even see the shape of the trunk. Then, from the absolute blackness, I heard the distinct sound of tearing fabric, followed by a single terrible wrenching sound. Not of a gunshot, but of something deeply organic being violently wrenched free. And then, just as suddenly, the light snapped back on. The kitchen was intact. Carol was whimpering softly by the pantry. The trunk was still there, the scorch mark faint. Sarah was gone. The only trace of her presence was the scent of lavender, now impossibly faint, and a single small object lying on the floor where she had stood, her wedding band sitting neatly atop a small pile of fine silvery dust, and across the room the fence was silent. The heavy vehicle was gone. I stared at the ring, then at the pile of dust, the final tangible proof of my wife's sacrifice. I had been given my freedom, bought with her final terrible binding. I was free. But as I reached for the ring, my hand brushed against something hard and cold inside my own trouser pocket, something that hadn't been there before. I pulled it out. It was the small, ornate silver locket. It was open, and inside, where the note had been, nestled perfectly against the velvet lining, was a single, impossibly bright crystal shard, throbbing faintly, and a new, tiny inscription etched into the silver casing, clearly visible under the kitchen light. Return to anchor. Contingency activated.